everyone. Welcome to this Tech Forum movie. My name is Philippe Duval. I'm part of the Empire, as you can see. I'm also an expert at Worldline and part of the Tech Squad.
And like Philippe, I'm also part of the Tech Squad and GA, so Global Architecture, and my name is Thomas Langlois.
And so, let's hope for the best. So, welcome to License Wars. Decades of peace in the galaxy allowed the Trade Federation, basically us, to use the open source resources of the Outer Rim. With the agreement of the old Open Source Federation and the CNCF Council. Maybe you know them from last year. But the Trade Federation exhausted all the open source resources. The Outer Rim systems are bankrupt, and the old Open Source Republic totally failed to support them. The revolt is rumbling. What will happen now? Disturbance in the open source force is rising as the Empire corrupts the Outer Rim systems with its new Black Star license Star Destroyer, taking even the CNCF by surprise. And this is a total catastrophe. I mean, this new Star Destroyer is going to rip out every system. To rescue the open source force, a small group of rebels is gathering, hopefully. Let's pray for the best. It's led by traders that still believe in the old open source republic. So, we are here today to represent them. But who are we first? We are traders, okay? We are from the Trade Federation. We do business, and we can be either hyperscalers, so AWS, Google, you name it. But we also, as Worldline, do business on the open source licensing models. We have been doing that for years. But now this is jeopardized. Open source is core to our business. And open source comes from the Outer Rim. So basically, this is all you can know of MongoDB, Apache Tomcat, Node.js, everything you can think of. That is open source, is a source of revenue for the trade merchants. But it's also a source of revenue for the empire, the evil empire that is coming. You have basically two sides, the rebels open source systems and the source available systems that are under control from the empire. And then you have the old republic. The Old Republic is basically, if you think about Richard Stallman being a Jedi, he's here. So this is the open source mindset. This is free as in free beer. Okay? Here are the forces at stakes. But where is the empire? We'll see that just after.
So let's explain the value of the Old Republic. So let's begin with a small disclaimer. We are not lawyers, it's a specific job. So if you have very touching specific point regarding the law, we are not able to answer. After that, let's begin to try to categorize source in 4 categories. The first one is the mercenary category, represented by the Mandalorian. In this category, we put all the non-free licenses. So basically, the proprietary, the trade secret, and the cloud source. In the opposite, we will speak a lot about the rebels, so Leia Organa, and we will speak about the FOSS, so free and open source. Let's deep dive in this topic. So, what entity decide if a license is open source or not, or free or not? We have 2 major entity. The first one is the open source initiative. This entity gives a stamp for the open source license. And we have the Free Software Foundation, another entity managed by Richard Stallman, mentioned by Philippe, which gives the free stamp. If we focus on open source value, so not free, open source, the first one is common, it's source code. You need to publish and share the source code of your application. The second one is derivative works. Basically, you can do what you want of type of works with this code source. The third one is your license must be technology neutral. If you don't like Python, Java, or things like that, you cannot put, I don't want my code to be used with Java library, for example. Now, if we go back on the right, we spoke about non-technical aspects. It's not possible to put a discrimination against a field of endeavor. Basically, you cannot say, I don't want my code to be used for military purpose or for nuclear purpose. And the last is the license must not restricted from not restrict other software. So basically, it's the key point which differentiates free license and open source license. You cannot say, if you use my lib and my code, you need to use, for example, the GPL v2 license. It's not possible. So let's continue with small definition. So what is a copyright? What is a patent? What is a trademark? I will do that quickly. So the copyright, it's all the legal aspects to control the creative work. And the patent is all the legal rights around invention. And the trademark is the same thing, but for the logo, for the mark, and so on. Let's take a simple example. If I take the Massachusetts Institute Technology, so the MIT license, it's a very small one, so only 50 lines. And we have key point to understand. We can easily link this software. We can distribute and modify it easily also, it's permissive. You can use it for private usage, it's not an issue. Regarding the patent and the trademark, nothing is automatic. You need to deal with it manually. And regarding the sub-licensing, it's possible. So clearly, this license is very permissive. If we continue, if we try to categorize the open source and free license, basically there are three big categories. Of course, it's very difficult because all licenses differ in specific points, so we try this step. So basically, copyright and copyleft. Copyleft is a joke about the copyright for the right. So we have a permissive category. Basically, you have all the open source license inside this category. You have the strong copyleft. I explained it previously, but some licenses have a contaminating aspect. So basically, if you use a library with that type of license, you need to use also this license. So for example, you use a library with GPL v2, you need to license your project in GPL v2. And you have, in the middle of the river, the weak copyleft. It's a big category, and if I try to summarize, often, if I take the example of the Mozilla public license, it's you can modify the code, but you need to give the code to the community. So, take for example, for permissive, I mentioned it already, but we have the MIT, for example, Node.js. For the Apache 2.0, we have the Apache Tomcat. It's not a surprise. For the weak copyleft, we have, for example, VLC. For the GNU Lesser General Public License, so LGPL. We have, for the Mozilla Public License, MPL, for example, LibreOffice or Firefox. And for the strong copyleft, we have OBS Studio and Joomla for the GPL v2. And for the GNU Affero GPL, so iGPL, we have, for example, Mattermost and Xcloud. Let's begin now with the Empire. So, a few years ago, about 8 years, a new type of source available, emerged. So we represent it by the Empire and its business license for RGCOP product, for example, or server-side public license for MongoDB or Elastic, or Confluent community license for a lot of projects inside the Confluent field. The common point for all this source available is you cannot use it in SaaS mode. So it's to prevent the hyperscaler to sell this software directly. And we have a last category, a very young one. It's ethical licenses. So basically, you can create a new project and say, okay, I want to refer to the Hippocratic license. Basically, this license mentions you cannot harm people, so physically or mentally. We have the NT996 license, which is against the overtime worker. So basically, in some company, people work from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. 6 days a week, and they are against that. So you cannot use this software inside this company. And we have the non-violence public license. This one is very large. You cannot harm people, degrade environment, do coercive thing. It's very, very large. So of course, there are lots of other ethical licenses, but I don't mention everything. Let's continue with the changes in the license. We mentioned that some license change. So basically, it's possible every license is not perpetual. You can decide to begin with MIT license and say, okay, I want to switch to business license, for example. And it's not only related to IT. For example, in the beginning of the last year, we have the same issue with the open gaming license for Dungeons and Dragons. After that, the key point in open source or free, it's the contributor. You need the contributor to commit, to modify the code, to update, and so on. It's the key point and the engine in every community. And we have multiple cases. The first one is you pay all the contributors. They are part of your company. So if you decide to change a license, it's not a big issue. You pay the guy to work on it, so no big deal. In the other hand, if all contributors are independent, if you decide to change the license, something can occur. They can decide to stop to contribute and switch the contribution to another project. They can decide to fork because they prefer the old license. They can decide everything. And the last one, in the middle of the river, if you have some company, big company working on it and contributing on it and independent guy, you need to deal with that.
Okay, now you have seen where the empire stays. But how did that all happen? Basically begins with the MariaDB system falling. After years of trade with trade federations, MariaDB is overtaken by the empire and decides to switch its business model to a business source license. So it's a source available license, but it's not an open source license per se. It prevents you to go into production with this license from the ground up. If you want to go to production, you have to comply with something called the special clause of the business source license. And for each and every business source license, it's different. For example, for HashiCorp, it means that you can do production with their product if you comply to the fact that you don't have a competing business with them. And then, eventually, after some years, you fall back to an open source license. So the code is open source back again, but maybe 2 or 3 years later. So if you run open source in production for MariaDB, you are basically 3 years late. That's their way to protect their outer rim business from the greediness of the trade merchants. Then happens the first corruption of Redis. In 2019, basically Redis added a specific clause to its license, which is back then Apache v2, that states that you cannot resold Redis code or Redis product alongside the Apache v2. So it's Apache v2 plus something on top. The problem with this approach is that the terms are really fuzzy, and this is really complicated to see what you are allowed to do with this version of Redis. I am able to do some business with something that embeds Redis or not. It's really legal stuff, and it's really fuzzy stuff. Then we have the infamous raid on MongoDB. MongoDB, under an assault of the Trade Federation, changed its license to server-side public license. Here, the terms are very clear. Feel free to use MongoDB as you wish. Feel free to publish MongoDB as a service as you wish. But every single line of code you add to MongoDB, you have to republish alongside. If you are an hyperscaler, this means that your service you have to open source also. This is to prevent you from doing business with their code. Finally, begins the clone wars. At this point, every open source system of the outer rim switches to another version of the source available licenses. They are all overtaken by the empire. They are all retiring. Beside these kind of licenses, to be sure that we as trade merchants cannot do business without them and without their intellectual property. But under the hood, there is this guy, the Senator Oracle. I think it's very clear for now, if you have listened to the keynote yesterday, that Oracle is not our big friend at the Trade Federation. He has played a double game for years now. At some point, he played the game of the merchants, providing some free stuff, and then playing the game of the outer rim, taking back this free stuff by changing the licenses without any further warning. And they played a double game also when they are basically advocating for open source Linux when Red Hat does specific moves. So they are really at some nasty game of playing back and forth the game of open source while trying to get the maximum money for it. So here, there is an assumption through the galaxy that Senator Oracle is indeed the leader of the empire himself.
After speaking about the big villain, let's speak about the fall of the CNCF Council. So basically, 2 years ago, we speak in this room, if I remember well, about the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, and we explain why, for us, it's a very good thing. So we speak about the different level of maturity and why CNCF is basically an industrial standard for software, code, and product. So basically, the CNCF define 3 levels of maturity. The first one is sandbox, basically young project, mature but not very much. The second one is incubating. For this step, you are using this project in a lot of companies. They are almost mature, but not totally. And the last one is graduated. It's very complicated to reach this level of maturity in the CNCF. You have some criteria, of course, define a correct governance, committer process, receive a majority vote from a council, have independent security audits, but the main point is you need to have committers for at least 2 different organizations. It's a good way to say, okay, my project will survive if one company changes its mind. But unfortunately, at the end of the last year, a T-Fighter crashed every ops we have. Why and who is it? Basically, it's Cisco. So at the end of 2023, Cisco bought Isovalent. So Isovalent is the company behind Cilium graduated project. Cilium is used everywhere in the Kubernetes field. It's a big component for the network part of Kubernetes. So it's used inside GCP, GKE, so in AWS, EKS, and so on. So it's very problematic, and now we don't have a solution.
Okay, now you see me coming. What will be the next Empired Apprentice? We have seen a lot of projects. There is one which is still open source, Kafka. Kafka is under the Confluent Galaxy. The Confluent Galaxy has a lot of products that are actually under the Confluent Community License umbrella, which is basically a source available license. It's proprietary to Confluent, except that Kafka is still open source. The core engine is still open source. It's under the Apache Foundation. But we, as trade merchants, and more especially hyperscalers, are doing a lot of business providing Kafka as a service against Confluent themselves that provide the same service on the marketplaces of this very hyperscaler. The question is, how long will it take to Confluent to move away from this license to a proprietary license that prevents the hyperscaler from selling their product without them earning a single amount of money? The only reason that we are still having Kafka open source and free is that it's under the Apache Foundation. It's a pure matter of community governance. And community is key here. We just have to hope that Apache stands for that. I still read that here. So here is when I personally, and I take it personally, I lost all hope. At some point, Red Hat decided to change the Red Hat Enterprise Linux packaging part from open source, as it was always be, to something that is a bit more closed. Basically, it's still open source if you are a subscriber. And then we all thought all hope was gone because it also meant that CentOS was gone. Remember Senator Oracle? That's when Senator Oracle said, okay, we have Oracle Linux. That will be free forever until we raise our prices, of course. Never forget that Red Hat was and still is our great rebels general. All hope is lost? I don't think so. We have a great disturbance in the force, but let's hope for the best.
So now, how to deal with that? So if you have a new library and you need to study it, how to be sure it's a rebel, an empire spy, for example, a mercenary, or something other. You need to have a sort of detector. So the first one is a framework assessment. So we have something like that inside the company. It's based on various sources, so some maturity level model, CNCF, we speak about that, the Apache maturity model, the open source foundation scoreboard, and an internal document named Qualification and Selection of Open Source Software, which is provided by TNO. And the last one is a tool named Claw Monitor, which allow you to scan a GitHub repository and provide you a report regarding this repository, which mention the level of security, the level of documentation, and so on. So with all these documents, you can assess if a library fits your needs or not. Of course, it's manual. After that, if you do some code in Java or Python or other language, you often need to have a lot of dependency. It's not possible to manually check each dependency and each license related to this dependency. Fortunately, JRS provide a tool named Dependency Track, which provide a such view. So you have your code, you have all the dependency needed, and you can have a full view of the license for each dependency and which is problematic, which is not. So we have some warning in this project. It's not a big issue. We can have error, of course, and okay. So it's a way to deal with that. Of course, this tool is installed inside Worldline, but it's part of the SBOM, so software bill of material, which is really common now in the software supply chain. But of course, we have new hope. So the first one, Philippe mentioned, we speak about Redis corruption. So this year, Redis was corrupt a new time. So he decided to go to the dark side of the SSPL. So he switched, and a good quantity of the population decide to migrate to another planet because they don't like the empire, of course. So basically, Valkey is an open source fork of Redis. This open source fork is mainly done by hyperscaler, but if I remember well, 3 or 4 years ago, there are a big announcement about Valkey, and a lot of companies announced to join the project. And now this is a good competitor for Redis. The second one is Oracle. It kills me to say that, but Oracle helps the open source and decide to adopt OpenTofu. So he decided to hide a rebel faction inside his planet. Basically, OpenTofu is a clone of Terraform from HashiCorp, which is totally open source. And Oracle decided to integrate OpenTofu inside its SaaS services. Of course, because HashiCorp changed the license, it cannot use it in the SaaS, so it decided to use OpenTofu.
Okay, let's back for a minute, okay? Star Wars is fun, but we have talked a lot about why it's cool to be on the light side and why we should avoid SSPL and BSL. Why it's cool to be on the light side? Because there are dangers of the dark side. And let's get straight to the point. It is crystal clear, and I think that the statement of Red Hat when they changed it, the license, is very spot on. Every open source developer deserves to be paid for its work. And this should be the case for every technology that is used by hyperscalers and also by people doing business on top of the open source. We'll get back to that. But basically, what happens when you trust something called open source, which is just source available? It means that there is only one company deciding everything. You cannot have any influence on the roadmap except for the business trades that you have with them. Okay, you have access to the source, but tomorrow the license can change. And this comes with potentially prices increases, okay? So tomorrow, maybe you are not able to sustain your own business. So everyone should be able to sustain their own business. Cloud providers, industrials that use open source and sell open source as a service, industrials that use open source as their supply chain. We should not be at the mercy of one single provider that decides that OpenJDK should be very, very expensive on every single machine we have. I don't target you, Oracle. This means also that you have source, okay, but fork is useless because there is no community to foster the source. There is only one single company. And finally, it's basically vendor locking with extra steps, right? And we try to avoid vendor locking, or we wouldn't be using open source in the first place. This is why we think that the light side matter. Staying free as in free beer, which has been the mantra from Richard Stallman for years. More agility, because no vendor lock-in means that you are able to deliver faster. More predictable incomes, because Oracle won't come to you to raise its license prices. They are not alone, okay? There are Dockers also. And open community means being able to adapt the product, and not to your need, not to the need of someone who decided it alone, but to the common good of the community. This is where standards grow. And this is where standards are meant to be constructed. How do we protect ourselves as Worldline from this kind of disruption in the force? How we protect ourselves from SSPL? As mentioned, you can use, of course, a lot of tools, but the most important thing is to have the mindset of be sure that when you choose an open source license, it's not just a piece of paper or indeed a markdown in a repository, but there is a community of contributors behind this. You can have the stars, the amount of stars in the GitHub repository and things like that. But the community is so much larger than just the people contributing to the code. It's also basically contributing as we should be doing. As Worldliners, we can contribute to the code. There is plenty of way to contribute to the community also by raising tickets, asking for questions, asking for new functionalities, putting in place, showing bugs, okay? Just opening a ticket on GitHub is already being part of this community. And driving the discussion around the new functionalities. We can be master of our own destinies if we get involved and if we stop consuming, harvesting, and pushing the open source project bankrupt, okay? So basically, this is a call to contribute to the open source so that tomorrow there is still open source project that we can buy from Red Hat. Okay, this is the time where we are talking about the obvious limitation that we have here. Far greater dangers await the outer rim. As trade merchants, we are safe, but if I was an open source project in the outer rim, I will be very afraid of this one. Do you remember when Disney acquired the Star Wars license and every single episode from there is shit? Gunnar, remember. We had this talk today. And indeed, this is the biggest villain of all the narrative. This is AI. Of course, because if your source is available, whether or not it's open source or source available, doesn't care. You don't care because at some point, AI will harvest that. And then you can listen to Raphael's talk about how we can mitigate that, how we can hope for the best and trust AI models to not use your industrial property, not use your intellectual property. But in the end, we all know that industrial property is just a matter of money in front of a lawyer. So if you have some open source business model on top of your head, beware of this guy, because I think he will be after your money harder than Oracle. Thanks a lot.